Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Caroline Makes Cards. Today's cards feature a number of Simon Says Stamps products. They all have rich gouache backgrounds and the elements are highlighted with beautiful pigment powders. These backgrounds have been transformed into shaker cards to highlight some beautiful sentiments from the set So Talkative. I began by stamping the leaves on Canson XL watercolor paper. 2 backgrounds were stamped for each of the 2 red rubber stamps, Interlocking Leaves and Peel Apart Fall Leaves. These beautiful background stamps were released during Stamptember, but I only just recently received them. Mail delivery in my area is extremely slow, especially for international mail. I've been dying to use these stamps. The weather here is turning quickly, and I knew that once the snow hits, I would be no longer in the mood for making fall cards. So I decided it best to use both backgrounds in one sitting. These designs are being stamped in my MISTI. Because they are an all-over design, I can't use the little magnets to hold my panel in place, so instead I use temporary glue dots. Because the red rubber stamps are thick, the insert for the MISTI has also been removed. All 4 panels have been stamped with Versamark ink, a clear, slow-drying ink designed for embossing. All of the embossing today is being done with Ink on 3's Gold Rush, one of my favorite gold embossing powders. I then get to work painting the backgrounds. I'm working with Arteza Gouache. Although gouache is a water-based paint, it is opaque. I wanted the backgrounds to be saturated so that the leaves would stand out, and the gouache certainly does the job. The paint was used straight from the tube, no water added. The paint is pretty thick, and to help it go on smoothly, I use a dampened brush. As I worked, I found that the paint would build up on the brush, and so I periodically cleaned it. But before I used it again, I made sure that all the excess water was removed and I was only working with a barely wet brush. Too much water would end up with the gouache losing its opacity. Painting all 4 of these backgrounds did take a fair amount of time, but I knew that once I moved on to the pigment powders, the pace would pick up. I have 2 different sets of pigment powders, Ken Oliver's Color Burst and Nouveau Shimmer powders. I have all of my powders swatched, so that was very handy in selecting which ones I would use for each panel. I ended up choosing powders from both sets. I was more interested in selecting the right color to go with the backgrounds, and also I was looking for those powders that had additional pops of color within them. The colors for both the gouache and the pigment powders have been listed on my blog for each of the 4 cards. Working with the pigment powders is a pretty quick and easy process. Clean water was first applied to the area of the leaves that I was coloring. As I'm holding the bottle, I use one of my fingers to lightly tap it to apply the powder to where the water is. Some of the powder has strayed into areas that I don't want it. I'm not concerned because of course the powders are activated by water. Once I'm finished painting, I'll just blow it off. Using a wet brush, I go in and help dissolve that powder and move it around. To get the color around the edges of the image, I do use a brush stroke, but in the center I try to keep it to a pouncing motion. The powders that I have chosen for all of these cards have a main color, but they also have additional pops of color within them. A brush stroke would blend all of those colors together. When working on the small detail area of these leaves and the small leaves of the other background, I don't wet the area before I tap the powder on. It just gives me a little bit more control over where that color is going to go. The powder is activated with a brush that is loaded with water. Not dripping, but also more than damp. Before moving on to a new area that is right next to a previously colored one, I do make sure that it is dry first. If the powder strays onto an area that you don't want it, if it is dry, that powder can easily be removed. I found that the leaves on this panel didn't have the color variation that I was looking for, so once everything was dry, I went back in with a color called Catherine Wheel and just added in a few drops of powder. To help this color have a more natural and organic look, I'm just going to use a spray bottle and lightly spritz the panel. Without applying any pressure, I use a corner of my paper towel just to pick up any water that may be pooling on the panel. All of the panels go into a protective box so that I can apply spatter. Using a number 1 brush, I apply tarnished brass, a distress stain. I then water down some black gouache and apply that. And I take my time and I apply a lot of spatter. As I finish with each panel, I remove it and move on to the next. And as you can see, I'm not only getting spatter on the panels, but I'm getting it all over my hand. I can't move on until everything is dry, and that distress stain takes a while. I then use dies from either A2 thin frames or thin circle frames to create my shaker opening. I hang on to both the die cut rectangle and its frame as it will form the background of the shaker. These dies are also used to cut matte gold cardstock so that there will be a frame around the shaker window. 3 of the 4 panels will be die cut using Simon Says Stamps stitched rectangles. But before I do that, I want to use the panel to help position the background for the shaker. I use a little bit of tape to hold that frame to the circle. I make sure that the pattern matches between the circle, the frame, and the background. The background for the shaker is adhered directly to the card base, which measures 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches, A2 size. The main panel is going to be adhered to black sheet foam. The foam is oversized, but I still use my panel to help me line up more or less where that opening for the shaker is going to go. The same die was used to cut the opening in the foam that was used for the panel. After the opening in the foam has been die cut for the other 3 cards, the panel is then cut with Simon Says Stamps stitched rectangles. Just the inner portion of this die cut panel will be mounted on foam. This, along with the double stitch detail that the die creates, adds a pretty edge for these cards. When creating a sentiment for a shaker, I like to put it right on the acetate so that it doesn't get lost with all the shaker material. Not any kind of acetate will do, it needs to be heat resistant. I use the window opening on my panel to line up the sentiment on the acetate. I apply anti-static powder before I stamp it with Versamark ink. The gold embossing powder is applied to the acetate and the excess powder is tapped off easily. Heat is applied just as if I was embossing cardstock. A microfiber cloth cleans up the anti-static powder. Although I trim some of the acetate down, I make sure to leave enough so that I can get the sentiment centered in the window opening. The panel is then adhered to the foam, making sure that the 2 window openings are aligned. I pop my MISTI on top to make sure that I have good contact between the foam and the paper while it dries. Tombow glue is going to be applied to the thin matte gold frames. It is left to dry completely. When Tombow is dry, it is tacky and I don't have to worry about any glue smearing on my acetate window. Shaker material that I'm going to be using for each card is mounted up in the center of the background that was attached to the card base. For the 2 cards featuring the interlocking leaves background, I use sequins. After the excess foam is trimmed from the panel, it is adhered to the card base. Again, I let it dry under the weight of my MISTI so that nothing goes out of alignment. The Tombow glue is dry and it is easy to position the thin gold frames onto the acetate. For the 2 cards using the peel apart fall leaves background, I decided to use seed beads as the shaker material. The leaves on these cards are quite a bit smaller than the other ones. The seed beads would still allow those leaves to show through the window. One thing that I need to mention, when assembling those cards that were die cut using the stitched rectangle die set, the outer stitched frame was adhered directly to the card base first before adding on the foam backed panel. For the cards with the interlocking leaves background, I added supporting sentiments. I love these sentiment label stickers by Tim Holtz. Unlike a lot of stickers, the adhesive on these is very strong and I adhere them directly to foam. Then these cute sentiments go directly onto the card bases and that wraps up these 4 shaker cards. I love pulling together different products to create a project. Simon Says Stamp Peel Apart Fall Leaves and Interlocking Leaves are perfect for autumn cards, but I can also see myself using them for springtime and summer cards as well. I love getting lots of mileage out of my stamps. And Simon's So Talkative sentiment set is perfect at any time of the year. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I appreciate your visit.